Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Zay Flowers, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my top 40 wide receiver rankings for Week 3 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Now, if you're looking for my thoughts on a specific player, you can travel down to the description of the video and check out the timestamps while you're down there. Be sure to subscribe and, of course, click the like button. We are on our way to 100,000 subscribers and cannot thank you guys enough for all the support. All right, without further ado, let's go ahead and transition into the wide receiver conversation in regards to matchups going into Week 3. I've gone ahead and accumulated the overall receiving statistics allowed by each individual defense based on the first 2 weeks of the 2024 season. We go ahead and isolate receiving statistics because the rushing upside of a wide receiver has nothing to do with the overall matchup on hand. As you can see from the first 2 weeks of the season, the Commanders, Detroit Lions, Philadelphia Eagles, three teams who are at the top of this conversation at the end of the 2023 season and thus far this season are still getting exposed based on their lack of talent in the secondary, of course, giving up a bunch of points. The Washington Commanders have allowed 6 receiving touchdowns thus far, of course, 4 in Week 1 and 2 in Week 2, especially against the New York Giants. It kind of gives you an understanding just how much potential guys like Jamar Chase, Andre Yoshivas, and if in fact T. Higgins plays this week, how much potential they have for fantasy upside. But either way, I'm going to refer back to these statistics over the course of today's episode. Also wanted to go ahead and show you perhaps some of the more disadvantageous matchups going into this week. We know that the Denver Broncos have a great secondary. They have Patrick Surtain, but typically teams don't really have to throw the ball against them, so it's not really an accumulation of statistics against their secondary when all you have to do is run out the clock in the second half. So as we progress over the course of the weeks, these statistics will even out and we'll get a better understanding as to the more advantageous and disadvantageous matchups going into a given week. Now, before I get into talking about my top 40 wide receiver rankings for Week 3, a reminder, after tonight's game between the New York Jets and the New England Patriots, I will be live streaming on the channel, so if you have any questions, be sure to swing on by. Speaking of the Jets game, for those of you who are trying to take advantage of the free customer pick of 0.5 total yards via Aaron Rodgers, you could travel down to the description and check out Underdog Fantasy at this current moment in time. If you travel on over to their website, use code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10. Not only will you be able to claim the first-time deposit offer, take advantage of the pick'em slip in regards to 0.5 total yards for Aaron Rodgers, but you'll also get my rankings sent to you every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. These rankings are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, all-encompassing rankings, including flex, to help you set your lineups and capture a 2024 fantasy football championship. So if you're eligible based on the map to the right side of the screen, having used the code in the past, you can go ahead and take advantage of the opportunity. If you are not eligible, have used the code in the past, you can also check out Patreon for weekly rankings. Thank you very much for all the support. Okay, let's get into talking about my top 40 rankings, beginning with our number 1, Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. I just mentioned it moments ago, the Washington Commanders are allowing 44.15 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format to opposing wide receivers thus far this season. You know, whether it was Malik Nabers last week, in Week 1, Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, all of them finding success, all of them finding the end zone. The expectation is this is the final time that you have an opportunity of trading for Jamar Chase this season. So you might as well go ahead and do it now or forever hold your peace, because he's going to have himself a monster performance after all the frustration that he built up last week against that Kansas City matchup. Number 2, we have CeeDee Lamb, who as of right now did pop up on the injury report as to the head coach of the Dallas Cowboys, Mike McCarthy. He did say that there was very little worry about the overall injury. I think they're just resting him in order to make sure that he is at 100% when we get to Sunday's game against the Baltimore Ravens. Again, this is a huge test on hand, and if in fact we're going to have CeeDee Lamb at 100% capacity, an automatic start as we typically know. You know, Davante Adams had himself a monster game against that Baltimore Ravens secondary in the second half of that game. So my expectation is that CeeDee Lamb should find himself a lot of success within the week as an automatic start. But not only that, this should be a high-scoring game. Based on Vegas overall total, this should be the second highest scoring game of the week. On number 3, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown, who, speaking of highest scoring games, for the last 3 weeks consecutively, the Detroit Lions have been implicated to be in the highest scoring matchups every single week, yet they have yet to reach that overall potential for success. But we're hoping this week against the Arizona Cardinals that we're going to get a bounce back performance from this, Detroit Lions offense and find ourselves scoring touchdowns, because that's truly what has been lacking. The fact that Jared Goff is coming off a performance of 0 passing touchdowns, only once last season had he accomplished that. So hopefully this is the final time we're going to see Jared Goff throw for 0 touchdowns. We're going to get back on track in regards to Amon-Ra's red zone opportunities. I mean, in terms of overall opportunities, 19 targets, 11 receptions, 119 receiving yards last week. Those are beautiful, but we're hoping for a bounce back performance that gives him opportunities to score touchdowns and get to this top tier conversation. Number 4, speaking of scoring touchdowns, a 97-yard receiving touchdown from Justin Jefferson last week against the San Francisco 49ers. A shocking victory in which, of course, the Minnesota Vikings defeat the San Francisco 49ers. Over the course of the last 2 weeks, Sure, the Minnesota Vikings have surprised many of us, but what is really bothering me is the fact that Justin Jefferson isn't getting a greater target share within this overall offense. The fact that he has only had 4 receptions in each of the last 2 games with Sam Darnold is a little bit worrying, but hopefully that number is only going to increase. I know that he's dealing with an injury. We're going to have to monitor that over the entire course of this week. If in fact Justin Jefferson regresses to an extent to where perhaps he does not play, we already know that we're trending towards Jordan Addison not playing. So if Jefferson's going to be out, then we would go ahead and potentially pivot to Naylor, but I think he will play. And I think he'll continue to play well as he has thus far this season. We're just hoping for double-digit target share and hopefully getting himself 7+ receptions going forward, because that at that point, we have no worry, even if he doesn't score a touchdown, in terms of what kind of fantasy upside he could potentially have. Number 5, speaking of the upcoming matchup between the Minnesota Vikings and, of course, the Houston Texans, we have Nico Collins, who over the course of the last couple weeks has been incredible, but this has been a trend going back to last season. As of the last 6 games he has played, 5 of them have consisted of 85 or more total yards. As long as they continue to give him the X opportunity and the double-digit targets, that is going to continue to lead to fantasy success. Now, the only thing that we have to worry about Nico Collins is that he's currently dealing with a hip/foot injury. He was popped up on the injury report. He was limited to a capacity. We're going to keep that monitored. If, in fact, he does not play this week, of course, that is an elevation to Stefon Diggs and Tank Dell's overall potential. But I do anticipate that Nico Collins will be ready by Sunday. Number 6, we have Davante Adams, who, again, like I mentioned last week, the anticipation was a huge bounce-back performance, and that is exactly what he delivered. With 12 targets, 9 catches, 110 receiving yards, and a touchdown, 21.5 fantasy points against the Baltimore Ravens, and now has an opportunity of taking on the Carolina Panthers, who could not stop Quentin Johnston last week from scoring 2 receiving touchdowns. So why not someone like Davante Adams, who is continuing to build a rapport with Gardner Minshew thus far this season? And I think going up against the Carolina Panthers, sure, the Carolina Panthers have changed their quarterback, but their secondary and their defense really hasn't stopped the soul either all season long. Number 7, we have Brandon Aiyuk. My expectation is that the absence of Deebo Samuel and Christian McCaffrey is just going to lead to more targets. Last season in 2023, in the 3 games in which Deebo Samuel either left early with an injury or did not play outright, Brandon Aiyuk was averaging 8.33 targets per game, which is significantly higher than his overall baseline average of targets last season, which was around 6.4. So if we're going to be in a situation in which Brandon Aiyuk is getting himself 8, 9, potentially 10 targets going into the given week against the Los Angeles Rams, understand that the Los Angeles Rams secondary has been in trouble. They've lost another player to the injured reserve in their secondary, and their primary number 1 cornerback, Tre'Davious White, hasn't been having the greatest games overall. He's been torched by Marvin Harrison Jr. and Jameson Williams, both of those receivers in the last 2 weeks, accumulating over 120 receiving yards and at least 1 receiving touchdown. So the expectation is a huge week here for Brandon Aiyuk and the San Francisco 49ers. Our number 8, we have our thumbnail of today's episode, DeVonta Smith. Of course, one of my favorite wide receivers going into the season. And in the absence of A.J. Brown, we are finding an abundance of success. First and foremost, last week, without A.J. Brown, 10 targets, 7 receptions, 76 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. The last time we saw him without A.J. Brown in the lineup was in the NFL playoffs last year against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. In that game, 8 receptions for 148 yards, 18.8 fantasy points. So we have seen DeVonta Smith, in the absence of A.J. Brown, be a solid number 1 wide receiver in fantasy football, and that's exactly what we're potentially trending towards this upcoming week, taking on the New Orleans Saints. Should be a potential high-scoring matchup between these two teams, hopefully firing back and forth. The only stat that I really want to mention outside of the fact that he's an automatic start is last season, DeVonta Smith only had 6 red zone targets. Thus far this season, already has 3. When you give him more exposure to opportunity in the most valuable part of the field, it will continue to elevate his potential for fantasy success. And if he's able to find himself 8 or more touchdowns this season, he'll continue his trend of success over the course of the last 2 years. Moving on to our number 9, we have Rashee Rice. You know what's funny? Rashee Rice last week quite literally had 50% of Patrick Mahomes' total passing yards. Patrick Mahomes had, 151? Rashee Rice finished with 5 receptions and 75 receiving yards and a touchdown. Thus far this season, of course, Rashee Rice has looked great. Over the course of the last, I would say, 9-10 games together, he's clearly been the number 1 receiving option ahead of Travis Kelce. And going into this upcoming week with a lack of a running game, potentially, with Isaiah Pacheco dealing with his injury and on the injured reserve, if in fact we're going to have Carson Steele and Samaje Perine as the number 1-2 combo, this may lead to a far more pass-heavy approach from the Kansas City Chiefs, which should lead to a lot of opportunity for Rashee Rice, considering his opportunities are relatively shallow and near the line of scrimmage as the slot receiving option of this offense. Moving on to our number 10, we have Marvin Harrison Jr. Again, patience is extremely important in fantasy football, and Marvin Harrison demonstrated that once again this week with a huge performance after having a dud performance in week 1. Now, obviously, he had himself 4 receptions, 132 receiving touchdowns, 27 fantasy points, and he did all of that in the first quarter. Imagine if this game had stayed close, and there wasn't an injured Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, and we could have gone back and forth in the second, third, or fourth quarter. Marvin Harrison could have had himself an absolutely legendary performance, but hey, it got cut short. Maybe perhaps this week, taking on the Detroit Lions, again, a defense that is allowing the second most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, an expected potential shootout, Marvin Harrison could have himself even more upside within the given week. Our number 11 is Chris Godwin. He's been playing far too well for me to ignore it and not have him in this top 12 conversation, especially when we're taking on the Denver Broncos. And the likelihood is that Patrick Surtain II is going to be following, someone of the caliber of Mike Evans. With that being the case, Chris Godwin's going to get himself a lot of opportunity, just as he has over the course of the last 2 games, being able to find himself in the end zone, being able to get himself over 7 receptions in each of the last 2 contests. I mean, when we talk about Chris Godwin getting over 83 receiving yards in each of these last 2 games, he was only able to accomplish that twice last season. He's already done it thus far this season. You can tell that Chris Godwin within this offense with Liam Cohen as the offensive coordinator, really allowing him to find his potential and be the Chris Godwin of old. Number 12, we have Tyreek Hill, who we would expect based on his talents, the fact that he is the fastest player in the National Football League, and he honestly tilts the field. Defenders and defensive coordinators have to respect the fact that on any single play, he can either make a reception out of the backfield and go to the house, or he could take the top off of the defense and score a touchdown. And quite frankly, I understand that the change of Tua Tagovailoa going to Skylar Thompson is a huge downgrade, but ultimately, the last time that we saw Skylar Thompson playing with Tyreek Hill, the final Skylar Thompson start, Tyreek Hill had 15 targets. If we're going to see some sort of level of opportunity share in that overall capacity, that is good enough to where the talent of Tyreek Hill with, let's say, for example, he gets 15 targets and maybe 7 receptions. Even with 7 receptions, he is so talented after the catch that he'll certainly be fantasy relevant, even in the absence of Tua Tagovailoa. Number 13, we have Chris Olave, who's going into an incredible matchup taking on the Philadelphia Eagles. Like we mentioned earlier, they are the 3rd best matchup at the position, allowing 37 fantasy points per game. So Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed should have themselves fantastic performances, especially considering thus far this season, Derek Carr amongst all quarterbacks is probably playing the best. He has the highest passing completion percentage in terms of adjusted passing completions. This excludes dropped passes when you spike the ball or when you throw the ball out of bounds just to throw it away. If you exclude those, he has the highest passing completion percentage amongst all quarterbacks. They've been playing extremely well. Now, Chris Olave hasn't seen much opportunity in the second half of games, so if this can be an exciting one against the secondary, the potential of Chris Olave to have a breakout performance this week, again, this is the reason why earlier in the week I said trade for Chris Olave now before it's too late. Number 14, we have Zay Flowers. Look, Zay Flowers is very difficult to ignore based on the fact that he is getting a huge volume of opportunity every game. The last 2 games, he's had himself double-digit targets, and additionally has himself 7+ touches in both games. Whether it's on the ground or through the air, they're trying to get him heavily implemented within this offense. They're trying to force feed the ball in the direction of Zay Flowers, and it's not really a surprise. He's an extremely talented wide receiver, now in his second year with even more experience and more of a rapport with Lamar Jackson. It makes sense that he's getting these overall opportunities. I mean, amongst all wide receivers thus far this season, he's number 4 in terms of total targets. Taking on the Dallas Cowboys, not really a matchup that I'm afraid of. I mean, we just saw the New Orleans Saints buzzsaw this defense, whether it's on the ground or through the air. So why not the Baltimore Ravens, who are trying to avoid starting 0-3 this season? Number 15, we have DK Metcalf. Metcalf's coming off a huge performance, a huge bounce back week, and now has to take on the Miami Dolphins. Against the Miami Dolphins, we have the classic matchup of DK Metcalf taking on Jalen Ramsey, a matchup that we used to see twice a year. Once, of course, Jalen Ramsey was with the Los Angeles Rams, but we haven't seen this in quite some time. This is going to be an exciting one. We're hoping for DK Metcalf to, of course, take the upper hand within this overall matchup, coming off a week in which he had 14 targets, 10 receptions, a $129 and a touchdown. Obviously, his receiving touchdown was on broken coverage, but as long as he's being given a high opportunity share in terms of double-digit targets, we really can't complain. Geno Smith, the second most accurate quarterback amongst all thus far this season. Number 16, we have Mike Evans. I understand that I mentioned earlier in regards to Chris Godwin, the fact that he will be probably matching up with Patrick Surtain. But in the last 10 years of Mike Evans' overall career, he's played against better cornerbacks. He's found himself a lot of success against great players. So why not once again this week taking on Patrick Surtain and the Denver Broncos? My only concern with Mike Evans is if in fact this team takes an early lead and is just running out the clock in the second half, maybe that lessens the overall potential for upside for Mike Evans. But either way, I trust Baker Mayfield. The rapport they've built over the course of last season and thus far this season continues to give us confidence that Mike Evans will be fantasy relevant every single week. Moving on to our number 17, we have Malik Nabers. This is one that I continue to go back and forth on. He's coming off of a huge performance of 18 targets, 10 receptions, a $127 in the touchdown against the Washington Commanders, the best matchup you could possibly find. Now, you go into a matchup this week against the Cleveland Browns, which against Denzel Ward is not going to be an easy matchup, but the volume of opportunity that they have given him so far this season within this offense gives me confidence in trusting Malik Nabers, especially with the routes that he was running last week. He saw himself a lot of opportunities in terms of crossing routes, saw a lot of opportunities in terms of go balls and even comeback routes. So if in fact they're going to give him the opportunities to make a lot of plays after the catch with those crossing routes, if they're going to give him the opportunities of making plays on the go ball, why not? Let's go ahead, throw him in here, and understand that they're going to be throwing the ball for this entire game against the Cleveland Browns. And of course, as long as Daniel Jones is looking towards his number one wide receiver option, Malik Nabers, he's going to have the opportunity. As long as he makes one singular play, he can make his entire fantasy week. Number 18, we have Garrett Wilson. He plays later tonight. And via Underdog Fantasy, they do have a discounted play of him having about 47.5 receiving yards. Take advantage of it if you haven't yet already. I understand that he's going to be shadowed by Christian Gonzalez for this entire game, and he's probably going to follow him, whether it's in the slot, whether it's out wide, doesn't matter. Gonzalez is a great cornerback, but even last week, Metcalf and JSN combined for 22 receptions. So if Garrett Wilson and of course Aaron Rodgers are on the same page, and Aaron Rodgers is going to give him the ample opportunity he deserves within this offense, then of course he's going to lead himself to success. But it's just a matter of, is that opportunity share going to be in line within an upcoming difficult matchup on a short week? Number 19, we have Drake London, who, if that final draft doesn't happen, all of us fantasy managers who have Drake London on roster are panicking right now. And many of you would be asking me, Andrew, should I be trading away Drake London? What can I get for him? X, Y, or Z? But we can all thank Saquon Barkley for dropping that pass on 4th down and giving Drake London and this offense a chance. Cousins and the offensive coordinator, Zach Robinson, of course, gaining a lot of confidence on that final drive and getting themselves in a position going into this week against the Kansas City Chiefs in which they need to have that confidence, because when you take on one of the best teams in the National Football League, one of the better secondaries in the league, of course, you're going to be put to the test. So Drake London, best of luck this week. We're hoping for a lot of success. It's just a matter of, can Kirk Cousins continue to play well? Are they going to spread this offense out and let Kirk Cousins really have himself an opportunity rather than just putting him under center and handing it off for the entirety of this game? Moving on to our number 20, we have Jameson Williams. It is very difficult at this point not to start him in a top 20 capacity, especially considering amongst all wide receivers thus far this season, number 5 in terms of total targets, number 3 in terms of total air yards. The opportunities are there, and the opportunities are certainly there down the field. With those kind of opportunities in an expected high-scoring matchup against the Arizona Cardinals, whose secondary I do not trust and I do expect to get exposed within the overall week, Jameson Williams is an automatic play based on his overall recent success. Number 21, speaking of recent success, we have Rashid Shaheed taking on the Philadelphia Eagles. The third best matchup at the position. Of course, Rashid Shaheed in each of the last 2 weeks has had himself huge receiving touchdowns and made himself a lot of plays in terms of those overall opportunities, all while not having a single reception within the fourth quarter. Imagine if this game can stay close. Imagine if they give him an opportunity to make deep plays down the field for the entirety of this game, all 4 quarters. He hasn't been given that opportunity in the first 2 weeks of the season. Could be in hand here against the Philadelphia Eagles, whose secondary, again, struggles mightily against wide receivers. Number 22, we have Stefon Diggs. Like I mentioned earlier, if Nico Collins is going to miss this week, obviously dealing with a hip and foot injury, Stefon Diggs would get himself a huge acceleration of potential, not to mention the fact that he has a revenge game on hand, taking on his former team, the Minnesota Vikings. The last time he took on the Minnesota Vikings as a member of the Buffalo Bills, it certainly seemed like a revenge game, as he had 12 receptions for 128 receiving yards. A huge performance. This upcoming week, he will see the primary coverage from Byron Murphy, who is their primary nickel cornerback and finding himself in the slot a lot. Thus far this season, Byron Murphy has allowed 8 receptions on 9 targets for 107 receiving yards to slot receiving options. So Stefon Diggs could be in line here for a huge performance. Number 23, speaking of slot receiving upside, we have Jaxon Smith-Njigba, who had a huge breakout performance. 16 targets is an unbelievable number, but getting himself 12 receptions, 117 receiving yards, 17.7 half PPR fantasy points. Last week, this was all while Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, and JSN all played 80+% of the offensive snaps. If they're going to just specifically sit in 11 personnel for 80+% of the overall game, the opportunities are certainly going to be there taking on the Miami Dolphins. Their secondary, again, they do have talent, but Kader Kohu, who is primarily their nickel cornerback, is going to have his hands full this upcoming week against Jaxon Smith-Njigba, who's hopefully going to maintain this high level of overall target share. I don't expect him to get 16 targets every week, but hopefully the confidence between him and Geno has only grown as of this performance. Moving on to our number 24, we have DJ Moore. DJ Moore gets an elevation of overall potential and sits at number 24 because I'm expecting to see Keenan Allen once again miss this week. Keenan Allen, again, is an older receiver. They want to keep him healthy, and I don't think they're going to rush him back. If, in fact, Keenan Allen does play this week, DJ Moore gets a little bit of a downgrade in terms of his overall potential. But, again, he may not even have a downgrade. Considering they played the Indianapolis Colts, that defense has been terrible all season. Of course, in week 1, we saw Nico Collins and Stefon Diggs find a lot of success. Even in week 2, wide receivers found success, even with Malik Willis playing quarterback with the Green Bay Packers in an offense that ran the ball 53 times within that game. So going into this week, I'm anticipating that DJ Moore will be given more opportunities, very similar to last week, in which they're kind of relatively close to the line of scrimmage. They're just trying to get him the ball and make plays after the catch. Because quite frankly, Caleb Williams, with only 4 completions of 10 or more yards down the field, isn't really able to give DJ Moore the opportunities he certainly needs and was having all of last season. The Colts are the 7th best matchup at the position. Moving on to our number 25, we have T. Higgins. Earlier today, we did get a little bit of a confirmation that he is in fact practicing. We even saw that prior to Sunday's game against the Kansas City Chiefs, T. Higgins was running routes before the game. So if in fact we are trending towards playing him, he's an automatic start in my opinion because of the Washington Commanders matchup. The best matchup at the position, allowing over 44 fantasy points per game and a half PPR to opposing wide receivers. The expectation would be that if in fact he's in your starting lineup. If he does end up missing, Andre Yoshivas, not a bad overall option against the Washington Commanders. Number 26, we have Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper amongst all wide receivers thus far this season, the 14th most targets. He's top 5 in terms of total air yards, and the opportunities are there, but unfortunately only has a 29% catch rate. Only garnering 5 receptions on 17 targets is ridiculous. I do anticipate that Amari Cooper, especially against the New York Giants, is certainly more capable than a 29% catch rate, and eventually once he's on the same page as Deshaun Watson, should find himself an abundance of success for the remainder of the season. Again, he has proven even last season with Deshaun Watson that he can score double-digit fantasy points on a consistent basis with Deshaun Watson as the starting quarterback. Just haven't seen it thus far this season, but eventually will. Number 27, speaking of finding eventual success, we have Michael Pittman Jr. I understand that Alec Pierce is the number 8 overall wide receiver in fantasy football, but that is not going to last. If you can, sell him to somebody who believes, because I do not. I believe in Michael Pittman Jr. I believe the talent. I believe the wide receiver who has finished as a top 24 wide receiver each of the last 3 seasons, regardless of whether he has played with Matt Ryan, whether he's played with Gardner Minshew, whether he's played with Carson Wentz. Anthony Richardson, yes, is another quarterback on this slate that he's trying to build rapport with, but going forward, he is eventually going to be the number 1 wide receiver of this offense. The Bears secondary is definitely a difficult matchup with Jalen Johnson, but the fact of the matter is, if we can see someone like Nico Collins last week have himself over 100 receiving yards, score a touchdown, why not Michael Pittman Jr.? If you give him the ample opportunity, he will take advantage of it. Moving on to our number 28, we have Jaylen Waddle. Like I mentioned earlier with Tyreek Hill, the hope is that the absence of Tua Tagovailoa won't hurt these wide receivers too much. Sure, it's going to hurt their baseline of overall production because Skylar Thompson isn't as good as Tua. But Skylar Thompson, the last time he played in the National Football League as a starter was his rookie year in 2022. So if in fact he is improved and we can get these wide receivers in a position with the overall scheme to make plays after the catch, rather than having to throw the ball into tight windows, just give them opportunities close to the line of scrimmage so that Jaylen Waddle can make plays after the catch, which we know he is certainly capable of doing. And of course, that'll elevate and probably build some more confidence with Skylar Thompson going into the week, which could keep it as a close matchup. Moving on to our number 29, we have Calvin Ridley. Again, Calvin Ridley's being given goal line rushing attempts. They're giving him opportunities near the red zone that a lot of other wide receivers within this offense are not seeing. DeAndre Hopkins, a non-factor overall. And as long as we can get into a position in which, of course, Will Levis isn't turning over the ball on a consistent basis, Calvin Ridley will be given his opportunity. In the last 2 weeks, he's had himself very difficult matchups with Jalen Johnson and Sauce Gardner. This week takes on another test with Jair Alexander, but Calvin Ridley is a good enough wide receiver to step up to the task on hand. Number 30, we have Jerry Jeudy. Now, the difference between Jerry Jeudy and Amari Cooper over the course of the last 2 weeks is that Jerry Jeudy is actually finding success. Even though he's not seeing as much opportunity, Jerry Jeudy scores a touchdown in week 1 and leads the team in terms of total offensive yards in week 2. So if we're going to be in a position in which Jerry Jeudy taking on the New York Giants secondary, which has not played well over the course of thus far this season and even going into last season, Jerry Jeudy should be expected to make an immediate impact and be a top 30 option going into the given week. I do anticipate both him and Amari Cooper to find success, mainly because, again, the matchup on hand implies that there is going to be success for Deshaun Watson within the passing game because this secondary has not played well. Number 31, we have George Pickens. George Pickens very easily should have scored double-digit fantasy points last week. He scored a 6-yard receiving touchdown called back because of a holding penalty from Van Jefferson. He had himself a 51-yard reception nullified by another holding call and had himself a 37-yard defensive pass interference by Patrick Surtain, which, of course, again, when you're getting penalties cooking you at this capacity, could have had himself over 100 receiving yards, could have had himself a receiving touchdown, very easily could have been in the top 20 conversation. Now, even though I don't like his target share, the fact of the matter is he's far too talented to ignore, and that's why I have him at this number 31 overall position. Number 32, we have Demarcus Robinson. So if in fact the Los Angeles Rams and Matthew Stafford want to compete in the absence of Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp, the only way to do so is making huge plays down the field for massive receptions. Just like in the way, of course, we saw Justin Jefferson find himself a 97-yard receiving touchdown last week, we would hope that Demarcus Robinson can take the top of the opposing defense and find success. And that is quite literally the only way that we're going to find success within this offense. Do not be surprised if they hit the play action and find them 40 yards down the field wide open. I honestly can very easily see it happening. That's the only way that they're going to scheme up an offense for this upcoming week, because quite frankly, without Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp, it is going to be very difficult to move the chains on 3rd and long. Number 33, we have Xavier Worthy. Look, Xavier Worthy, every single game is going to touch the ball maybe 3 to 4 times. Some of these games, 3 or 4 touches is all you need to score a touchdown. And in others, you're going to end up with 3.2 fantasy points just like he did last week. So the opportunities are going to be scarce, but hopefully the lack of the running game without Pacheco is going to lead to far more passing and hopefully looking in the direction of Xavier Worthy deep down the field against this Atlanta Falcons secondary. Number 34, we have Adam Thielen, who I trust wholeheartedly going into this week. Like I mentioned earlier, he already has a built rapport with Andy Dalton. The fact they were on this team together last season gives him an advantage over guys like Diontae Johnson. Additionally, last season, in week 3 with Andy Dalton as the starter, 14 targets, 11 receptions, a $145 and a touchdown, 26 fantasy points for Adam Thielen. Played 94% of the offensive snaps in week 2. And of course, pretty much open on a majority of the overall routes, but Bryce Young, unfortunately, not able to get the ball in his direction. Last season, Adam Thielen proved from weeks 2 through 11, averaging 15 fantasy points per game, 8 receptions per game, 80 receiving yards, a half a touchdown per game, putting up a monstrous performance throughout that span of time that he still has a lot left in the tank, and he'll show that once again this week. Now, continuing on the conversation of the Carolina Panthers receiving core, Diontae Johnson was brought in to be the number 1 receiving option. And in the elevation of Andy Dalton and absence of Bryce Young, we should see a lot more opportunity, quality opportunities in terms of targets go in the direction of Diontae Johnson to make him a relevant fantasy wide receiver. Otherwise, the last 2 weeks, he's been ghost radio silent and been a non-factor, taking on the Las Vegas Raiders, an advantageous matchup for sure. Number 36, we have Terry McLaurin. He showed signs of life last week with 8 targets, 6 receptions, but only 22 receiving yards. When you are not getting a huge ADOT in terms of average depth of target, and the overall opportunities aren't giving Terry McLaurin the possibility of making plays after the catch, then unfortunately he's capped to being like a number 36. He's going to be given opportunities in terms of targets, and the Bengals offense is probably going to be blowing out the Washington Commanders defense. Therefore, this should be a negative game script, which leads to a lot of targets. But unfortunately, if he's not being put in the position to succeed, the overall upside for fantasy success is going to be limited. Number 37, we have Brian Thomas Jr. Brian Thomas Jr. should probably be in this top 36 conversation. My only concern is the Bills secondary. The Bills secondary has not only shut down Marvin Harrison Jr., but Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle. Even prior to Tua Tagovailoa's injury, again, there was 3 interceptions that give us an understanding as to what I'm talking about in terms of shutting down that offense. So if in fact they're going to shut down an offense like the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have not played well thus far this season at all in any sort of capacity, the expectation would be that Brian Thomas Jr. should be expected less potential for upside based on the overall matchup on hand. That being said, last season, Trevor Lawrence against the Buffalo secondary, over 300 yards, had himself a monster performance, and hopefully we can find that overall upside within the given week. I just don't trust it. All right, let's move on to our number 38. Speaking of the Buffalo Bills, we have Khalil Shakir, who seems to be Josh Allen's favorite target. And as long as that is going to continue to be the case, whether it's on the ground, through the air, giving him an abundance of overall opportunities in comparison to the rest of the field. Again, Keon Coleman seeing 0 targets last week. As long as Khalil Shakir continues to get opportunity, he's going to be valuable considering the offense he's associated with and the quarterback. Number 39 is Tank Dell. I understand. I expected a lot out of him last week. 1.8 fantasy points is not going to cut it. But if, in fact, again, we are going to be in a situation which Nico Collins is limited with a hip/foot injury, Tank Dell could be asked to do more in the given week, which we're hoping for, especially considering he has been ghost radio silent himself thus far this season. The final player I wanted to mention is a little bit of a Hail Mary of sorts. It is Christian Kirk. I do trust Christian Kirk to be a talented wide receiver, but I do not trust Trevor Lawrence to give him enough opportunity. Only 8 targets and 2 receptions in the last 2 weeks is just disgusting. But we're hoping that in the absence of Evan Ingram, they're going to kind of fine-tune this offense and get the ball into their best receivers' hands, which is Christian Kirk, taking on a very difficult matchup in the Buffalo Bills. All right, that's going to cover it in terms of my top 40 wide receiver rankings. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I'll be back tomorrow with Hidden Gems. Of course, if you haven't yet already, subscribe to the channel, click the like button down below. And if you have any questions, be sure to swing on by after tonight's game, as I will be here live streaming. Thank you everybody for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.